On the deck of the USS Nevada during a live strategic exercise, a young female officer was being escorted away in front of hundreds. "You no longer have clearance here. Leave," Admiral Hunt said coldly while some sailors whispered, "Wasn't she Echo 01? The living glitch." Rachel Moore, black hair, loose-worn infantry boots. Calm gaze boarded the helicopter without turning back. But just minutes later, the nuclear control system rejected all current voice commands, and only one old name remained, recognized hers. And when her voice came through the microphone, the entire national arsenal lit up again, under the stunned eyes of everyone present. Rachel's boots hit the deck with a soft thud, each step steady despite the weight of every eye on her. The Pacific wind whipped her hair across her face, but she didn't brush it away. She just kept walking, her plain uniform, stripped of any rank, no badges, no shine. The sailors parted as she moved toward the chopper, their murmurs trailing her like a shadow. Some looked curious, others smug. A young ensign, his cap tilted just so, leaned toward his buddy and snorted. "She looks like she crawled out of a surplus store." His friend laughed loud enough for her to hear. Rachel didn't flinch. Her hands stayed loose at her sides, her face blank, but her eyes sharp gray. Unyielding caught the ensign for a split second. He stopped laughing. She kept moving. A petty officer, broad-shouldered with a smirk that showed too many teeth, stepped into her path, blocking her way to the chopper. He held a clipboard, flipping it casually, but his eyes were mean. "Hey, Moore, you forget where the mess hall is. This ain't your deck anymore." The crowd around him snickered a few, nudging each other. He leaned closer, his voice dropping. "Bet you're just here to fetch coffee for the real officers." Rachel stopped, her boots scuffing the deck. She looked up at him, her gaze steady, and tilted her head just enough to make him shift his weight. "Funny," she said, her voice low. "Last I checked, coffee doesn't arm missiles." The petty officer's smirk faltered, his clipboard slipping slightly in his hand. The crowd's laughter choked off, and Rachel stepped around him, her stride unbroken. The helicopter's blades were already spinning, the noise drowning out the whispers. Admiral Hunt stood at the edge of the deck, his jaw-tight arms crossed. He was a tall man, silver hair cropped close with the kind of presence that made junior officers stand straighter. His voice carried over the wind, clipped and final. "Lieutenant Moore, you were told to leave. This isn't your place anymore." A few sailors nodded, their smirks barely hidden. One, a wiry guy with a fresh tattoo peeking out from his sleeve, called out, "What's she even doing here? Thought we upgraded past dial-up." Laughter rippled through the crowd. Rachel paused just for a moment, her fingers brushing the strap of her old canvas bag. She looked at the sailor, her gaze steady, and said, "Dial-up still works when the system crashes." The laughter died. She stepped onto the chopper. Before the door could slide shut, a shout cut through the noise. A systems engineer, his uniform wrinkled and sweat-stained, sprinted across the deck, nearly tripping over a cable. His face was pale, eyes wide. "Admiral, the nuke control panel, it's locked." The crowd went quiet. Hunt turned, his expression unreadable. "What do you mean, locked?" The engineer, barely catching his breath, pointed toward the command tower. "Voice commands, they're failing. All of them. It's rejecting every officer's code." Rachel, one foot still on the chopper's skid, froze. Her fingers tightened on the doorframe, but she didn't turn around. The engineer's voice cracked. "It's waiting for an old code, one we never purged. Echo 01. Every head swiveled toward Rachel. A junior officer barely out of the academy, his uniform still creased from the box, pushed through the crowd, his face flushed with indignation. "Echo 01. You're joking, right? Her..." He pointed at Rachel, his finger jabbing the air like a weapon. "She's a has-been who got lucky once. We're supposed to trust her with national security." His voice rose, cracking with frustration, and a few sailors nodded, their arms crossed. Rachel's hand lingered on the chopper's door, her knuckles whitening for a split second. She turned her head just enough to meet his eyes and said, "Luck doesn't unlock nuclear warheads." The junior officer's face froze, his finger still pointing, but no words came out. The deck was silent, save for the hum of the chopper. "Hey, if this story's hitting you, grab your phone real quick. Give this video drop a comment about what's resonating with you and hit that subscribe button. It means a lot to keep sharing these stories with you all. All right, let's keep going." The deck felt colder now, the wind sharper. Admiral Hunt's face twisted like he had bitten into something sour. "Echo 01. That's a decommissioned call sign." He snapped. A lieutenant nearby, a woman with perfectly pressed cuffs and a sneer that matched, stepped forward. You're saying our entire defense system is tied to her. Some washed-up nobody. Her voice dripped with disdain, loud enough to carry over the chopper's whine. A few sailors chuckled nervously, glancing at Rachel. She stood there, one hand on her bag, her face still as stone. The lieutenant kept going. What's she gonna do? Whisper some magic password from the Stone Age. More laughter, but it was thinner now, uneasy. Rachel tilted her head just slightly and said, "Funny how old systems outlast new egos." The lieutenant's smirk froze. The deck went quiet again. A navigation officer, his glasses fogged from the sea air, leaned toward a colleague, his voice sharp with mockery. "She's probably just here for a photo op. Wants to feel important one last time." He adjusted his glasses, smirking as he glanced at Rachel's retreating figure. The colleague, a man with a buzzed haircut and a nervous twitch, nodded. "Yeah, bet she's loving this, standing there like she's still relevant." Rachel's steps slowed for a fraction of a second, her hand brushing the edge of her bag. She didn't turn, didn't respond, but her fingers curled tightly around the strap, her knuckles pale. Then she lifted her chin, her eyes fixed on the chopper, and kept walking. The navigation officer's smirk faded as a gust of wind knocked his glasses askew, his hand fumbling to catch them. Inside the command tower, the air was thick with tension. Monitors blinked red, their alerts pulsing like a heartbeat. Officers crowded around the nuclear control panel, their voices overlapping in a frantic hum. A senior commander, his medals gleaming under the fluorescent lights, tried his voice code again. "Authorization Bravo 69er initiate." The screen flashed, "Access denied." He cursed under his breath, slamming a fist on the console. Another officer, younger, with nervous sweat beading on his forehead, tried next. "Authorization Delta 42, initiate." Same result. The engineer, still panting from his sprint, pointed at the screen. "It's locked on a single voice print. Echo 01. Nobody else can override it." Hunt's eyes narrowed. "And you're telling me she's the only one?" The engineer nodded, his hands shaking. "Unless she speaks, the whole system's dead." A communications officer, her headset dangling around her neck, leaned over to a colleague, her voice low but sharp. "This is a joke, right? We're begging for her help now." She gestured toward the chopper where Rachel still stood, her silhouette framed against the gray sky. "She's been irrelevant for years. Probably forgot how to even read a console." The colleague, a man with a buzz cut and a nervous tick in his jaw, nodded. "Yeah, bet she's just standing there to soak up the attention." Rachel's fingers brushed the edge of her bag, her eyes fixed on the horizon. She didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them, but her shoulders squared just slightly, and she took a slow breath, her lips pressing into a thin line. The communications officer's voice faltered, her headset slipping from her hand. Rachel was already halfway to the chopper's door when a junior officer ran up, his boots skidding on the deck. "Lieutenant Moore, they need you back." She stopped her back to him, her shoulders barely shifting. The crowd watched, their whispers fading. She turned slow and deliberate, her eyes scanning the faces around her. The ensign from earlier, the one with the surplus store jab, shifted uncomfortably, his bravado gone. Rachel didn't say a word. She just stepped off the chopper, her boots hitting the deck again, and started walking back toward the tower. The sailors parted like a tide, their eyes darting between her and the Admiral. Hunt's jaw clenched so hard it looked like his teeth might crack. "This better not be a mistake," he muttered. As Rachel crossed the deck, a maintenance chief, his hands stained with grease and his eyes narrowed, muttered to a group of sailors nearby. "She's got no business being here. Look at her. Those boots are older than half this crew." He spat on the deck just close enough for her to notice. The sailors around him laughed, one slapping his shoulder. Rachel's stride didn't break, but her hand paused on her bag, her fingers curling around the strap. She glanced at the chief, her eyes cold but steady, and said, "Old boots still walk through fire." The chief's laugh died in his throat, his spit drying on the deck as she passed. The sailors around him shuffled their eyes, dropping to the ground. Back in the command room, the air felt like it could snap. Officers stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mix of disbelief and resentment. A tech specialist, a wiry guy with glasses sliding down his nose, muttered to his colleague, "She's gonna choke." Bet she forgot the code years ago. His colleague, a woman with a tight ponytail and a clipboard clutched to her chest, nodded. Why is she even still in the system? Should have been wiped when she got the boot. Rachel walked in her steps, measured her old boots scuffing softly on the polished floor. Every eye was on her. The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs leaned against a console, arms crossed. "Well, go on Echo 01. Save the day, or crash it." Rachel didn't look at her. She just stepped up to the mic, her fingers brushing the edge of the console. A radar tech, his fingers trembling as he adjusted his screen, whispered to the officer next to him. "This is insane. We're trusting her with the whole fleet. She's nobody." His voice was sharp, almost panicked, and a few heads turned, nodding in agreement. Rachel's hand paused on the mic, her fingers steady, but her knuckles pale. She didn't look at the tech, didn't react. Instead, she adjusted her stance, her boots planted firm, and leaned closer to the mic. "Systems don't care about your opinion," she said, her voice quiet but cutting. The tech's hands froze on his keyboard, his face flushing as the room's attention shifted to him. Rachel's eyes flicked to the screen, her expression unchanged. The screen in front of her glowed red, the words, "Voice authentication required," pulsing in bold. Rachel stood still, her face unreadable but her hands steady. The room held its breath. She leaned forward, her voice low, but clear, each word clipped and precise. "Authorization, Echo 01, initiate sequence." 7 words, no more, no less. The screen flickered. A green bar slid across it. Voice match 99. 99% confirmed. The room erupted in a soft hum of beeps and clicks as the system came alive. Payload doors unlocked with a heavy thud. Radar screens lit up, reconnecting to global networks. A threat marker on the map, blinking red just moments ago, vanished. Someone in the back whispered, "Holy hell, she did it." A weapons officer, his face red with frustration, slammed his hand on a nearby console, his voice loud enough to echo. "This doesn't make her special. Anyone could have said those words if the system was rigged for her." He gestured wildly at Rachel, his eyes flashing with resentment. A few officers nodded, their murmurs rising. Rachel's fingers lingered on the console, her movements pausing for a heartbeat. She turned slightly, her gaze locking on the weapons officer, calm but piercing. "Rigged systems don't stop wars," she said, her voice, even each word, landing like a stone. The officer's hand dropped, his face paling as the room's hum quieted. Rachel turned back to the console, her hands moving again, steady as ever. The silence that followed was heavy, like the air before a storm. Admiral Hunt's face was a mask, but his eyes burned. He stepped forward, his voice low and sharp. "Don't get comfortable more. This doesn't mean you're back." The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs smirked again, her voice cutting through the hum of the consoles. "Yeah, don't get any ideas. You're just a glitch we had to use." A few officers nodded, their expressions cold. Rachel didn't respond. She just straightened up her hands, sliding into her pockets, and turned toward the door. The junior officer from earlier, the one who'd whispered about her being a myth, stared at the floor, her cheeks flushed. Rachel paused, her gaze lingering on the officer for a moment, then walked out without a word. Outside, the deck was quieter now, the chopper's blades still. Rachel stood by the railing, the ocean stretching out endless and gray. Her fingers brushed an old keychain in her pocket, a faded leather tag with a single word etched into it. Duty. She'd carried it since her first deployment, back when she was barely 22, standing in a different command room, her voice the only one the Blackbird system trusted. The memory came and went quick as a wave. She didn't linger on it. A sailor nearby, the tattooed one from before, glanced her way, then looked down, his jaw tight. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. A young ensign, her ponytail bouncing as she jogged across the deck, stopped short when she saw Rachel. She hesitated, then blurted out, "You're really her, aren't you?" Echo 01. Her voice was a mix of awe and disbelief, her eyes wide. A few sailors nearby turned their conversations, pausing. Rachel didn't answer right away. She just looked at the ensign, her fingers still on the keychain, and gave a small nod. The ensign's face lit up, but before she could say more, a senior officer barked, "Get back to your post." The ensign flinched, her shoulders slumping, but she glanced at Rachel one last time, her eyes shining. Rachel's lips twitched, not quite a smile, before she turned back to the ocean. Back in the command room, the mood was shifting. A tech pulled up a file on his screen, his brow furrowing. "Sir, her access, it's not just active. It's in emergency lock mode." Hunt spun around. "What does that mean?" The tech swallowed hard. "It means the system won't let us delete her code. Not without her confirming it in person." The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs scoffed. "So, we're stuck with her. That's a security risk." But the tech shook his head. "No, ma'am. It's the opposite. Without her, we'd have lost the entire payload. She's the only reason we're still operational." The room went quiet again, the weight of his words sinking in. A logistics officer, his clipboard stacked with papers, leaned toward a colleague, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Great. So we're all just pawns to her little voice trick now. He flipped through his papers, shaking his head. Bet she planned this waiting for her big moment. The colleague, a woman with a scar across her cheek, rolled her eyes, but didn't disagree. Rachel, now back near the command room's entrance, overheard. Her hand paused on the doorframe, her fingers tapping once, twice. She turned, her eyes locking on the logistics officer. Planning doesn't save a fleet in 10 seconds, she said, her voice calm but sharp enough to cut glass. The officer's papers slipped, scattering across the floor. He didn't pick them up. A new alert flashed on the main screen, cutting through the tension. Video feed secure line. The officers froze. The president's seal appeared, followed by his face stern but calm. Everyone stood a little straighter, even Hunt. The president's voice came through steady and clear. Lieutenant Rachel Moore, your voice just prevented a catastrophic failure of our national defense system. Rachel, still out on the deck, didn't hear it yet. She was looking at the horizon, her fingers still on that keychain. Inside, the president kept going. You're not just reinstated, Moore. You're taking command of this vessel's strategic operations, effective immediately. That's an order. The room was silent. The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs dropped her arms, her face pale. As the president's words echoed, a senior aide, his tie slightly askew, fumbled with a tablet, pulling up Rachel's file. His hands shook as he scrolled, his voice barely a whisper. Her record, it's not just the Blackbird system. She designed half the protocols we're using. The room turned to him, their faces a mix of shock and embarrassment. He kept scrolling, his eyes widening. She trained the entire first wave of voice command operators. She's in the system because she built it. The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs stared at her shoes, her hands clenched. Rachel, still outside, didn't hear the aide's words, but her fingers tightened on the keychain, her jaw set as she watched a distant ship on the horizon. Hunt's face was unreadable, but his hands were fists at his sides. He turned to an aide. Get her back in here. Now? The aide ran out, his boots echoing on the deck. Rachel was still by the railing when he found her. Lieutenant Moore, you're needed in the command room. Right away? She didn't ask why. She just nodded, her expression calm, and followed him back. The sailors she passed didn't whisper this time. A few stood straighter, their eyes lingering on her. One, a young woman with a braid, gave her a small nod. Rachel didn't return it, but her eyes softened for a moment. A deckhand, his face weathered from years at sea, watched Rachel pass, his hands still on a coil of rope. He muttered to a nearby sailor, "She's the one who saved us, and we treated her like garbage." His voice was low, rough with regret. The other sailor, younger, nodded slowly, his eyes fixed on Rachel's back. Yeah, we messed up. The deckhand shook his head, his hands tightening on the rope. No, we didn't just mess up. We betrayed her. Rachel didn't turn, didn't acknowledge them. But her steps slowed for a moment, her fingers brushing the keychain again before she pushed through the command room door. When she stepped back into the command room, the air felt different. Thicker. The officers parted as she walked, in their faces a mix of shock and something else, respect, maybe, or fear. The president's face was still on the screen, his gaze steady. Lieutenant Moore, he said, his voice carrying across the room. You never left. You've always been part of this system, and now you're in charge of it. Rachel stood still, her hands at her sides, her face calm. She didn't look at Hunt, didn't look at the lieutenant or the techs or the screens. She just nodded once and said, Understood, sir. The screen went dark. Hunt stepped forward, his movements slow, deliberate. He stopped in front of Rachel, his eyes locked on hers. For a moment, it looked like he might say something sharp, something bitter. But then he straightened his shoulders, squaring, and saluted. Crisp, formal, the room held its breath. Rachel returned the salute, her movements just as precise. She didn't smile, didn't gloat. She just said, Condition 1 readiness. Begin global command. Her voice was steady, like she'd been giving orders her whole life. The officers moved fast, their hands flying over consoles, their voices low and urgent. The system hummed back to life. A signalman, his hands calloused from years of handling cables, stood at the edge of the room, his eyes fixed on Rachel. He whispered to a nearby tech, I saw her once, years ago, running drills no one else could keep up with. His voice was thick, his hands clenching at his sides. We laughed at her boots, but she was carrying us all along. The tech, a young woman with a nervous fidget, nodded, her eyes glistening. Rachel didn't hear them. She was at the console, her fingers moving with precision, her voice steady. But her hand paused for a moment, brushing the edge of her pocket where the keychain rested, as if it anchored her. The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs stood frozen, her face pale. She opened her mouth, then closed it, her eyes darting to the floor. A tech nearby whispered to his colleague, "She's not just some glitch. She's the backbone." The colleague nodded, his eyes wide. Rachel didn't hear them. She was already at the main console, her fingers moving across the controls, her voice calm as she issued commands. The screens lit up, data streaming in from global networks. The threat was gone, but the system was hers now, and everyone knew it. A junior tech, his hand still hovering over his keyboard, glanced at Rachel, his voice barely audible. "She's been carrying this ship the whole time, hasn't she?" His colleague, a woman with a streak of gray in her hair, nodded slowly. "Yeah," and we spat in her face for it. Her voice cracked, her hands clenching into fists. Rachel didn't look their way. She was focused on the console, her fingers moving with precision, her eyes scanning the data. But her shoulders relaxed just a fraction, as if she'd heard them anyway. The room kept moving, the hum of the system steady under her command. Word spread fast. By the next morning, the deck was buzzing again, but the tone was different. Sailors glanced at Rachel as she walked by, their whispers quiet, respectful. The ensign with the surplus store jab was nowhere to be seen. Later, someone said he had been reassigned to a desk job, stateside, his file flagged for insubordination. The tattooed sailor, the one who'd mocked her dial-up line, was quieter now, his head down as he worked. A post on X, anonymous but detailed, laid out his comments from the day before. By evening, his name was trending, and not in a good way. Nobody said Rachel had anything to do with it. Nobody needed to. The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs faced her own reckoning. A formal review came down from command, citing her conduct as unprofessional. Her sponsorship for a high-profile defense contract was pulled, and her name stopped showing up on the guest lists for officer galas. She didn't say much after that, just kept her head down, her cuffs still perfect, but her smirk gone. The junior officer, the one who'd whispered about her being a myth, was different. She approached Rachel later, her voice low, her eyes red. "I was wrong about you," she said, her hands twisting together. Rachel just looked at her, her gaze steady, and said, "Keep learning." The officer nodded, her face flushed, and walked away. Rachel's husband arrived that afternoon. He stepped off a chopper, his uniform plain, but his presence heavy, tall, broad-shouldered, with a face that didn't need to raise its voice to command a room. Nobody said his name, but the air shifted when he walked in. Officers straightened their conversations, stopping mid-sentence. The tech with the glasses looked away, his hands fumbling with his keyboard. The lieutenant with the pressed cuffs froze her coffee cup halfway to her mouth. Hunt's jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. Rachel's husband walked straight to her, his steps slow, deliberate. He didn't say much, just rested a hand on her shoulder for a moment. She didn't smile, didn't lean into him. She just nodded once and turned back to the console. As Rachel issued commands, a young sailor barely 19 stood at the edge of the command room clutching a tablet. His eyes were wide, his hands trembling slightly. He whispered to a friend, "I saw her file. She's been saving us since before I was born." His friend, a woman with a short bob and a nervous smile, nodded. "Yeah, and we called her a relic." Her voice was thick, her eyes glistening. Rachel didn't hear them. She was focused, her voice steady as she directed the crew. But her hand brushed the keychain in her pocket, her fingers lingering on it for a moment longer than usual. The command room was quieter now, the hum of the systems, the only sound. Rachel stood at the center, her hands steady, her voice low as she issued orders. The screens glowed green, the data flowing smoothly. Nobody mocked her boots anymore. Nobody whispered about glitches. The sailors who'd laughed were gone or silent. Their careers shifted in ways they hadn't expected. Rachel didn't look back at them, didn't linger on their faces. She just kept moving forward, her steps, sure, her eyes on the horizon. The deck was calm that evening, the ocean stretching out under a gray sky. Rachel stood by the railing, again her keychain in her hand, her fingers tracing the word duty. She didn't need to say anything, didn't need to prove herself. The system had spoken for her. The truth had caught up. And for everyone watching, everyone who'd ever been dismissed, judged, or silenced, her silence said enough. You weren't wrong. You weren't alone. You carried on. Where are you watching from? Leave a comment below and hit follow to walk with me through heartbreak, betrayal, and finally healing.